So welcome, everybody. I want to welcome you here to our discussion about the economics and politics of immigration. I'm Camille Busette. I'm the Interim Vice President for Governance Studies here at Brookings, and it's a pleasure to welcome you. As I usually do before these events start, I want to thank our events and security staff who are always vital to ensuring a successful event. So by way of introduction, as many of you know, immigration consistently shows up on public opinion polls as one of the issues of greatest concern to voters. Much of the public debate over immigration is colored by emotion, fear, xenophobia, hyperbole, misunderstanding, and political posturing. Our goal today is to inject into the public debate over the economics and politics of immigration facts and evidence-based analysis. Brookings is particularly well suited to accomplish this because of the breadth of our expertise across a range of policy domains. And today that is illustrated by the fact that this conversation is a joint effort of the Governance Studies Department and the Economic Studies Department here at Brookings. We cannot hope to bust all the myths or clarify all the misconceptions about immigration in an hour-long conversation, but we do hope to take a few steps in that direction. So let's start with some facts. There are broadly three types of policies that govern immigration into the United States. The visa policy. So legal immigration into the U.S. can be accomplished by applying for a visa or being a successful applicant to the diversity immigrant visa lottery. There is also an extensive set of visas for employment and educational purposes. We also have asylum policy. One can also enter the U.S. legally as an asylum seeker. The asylum policy of the United States is governed by the Refugee Act of 1980. And under this law, the United States recognizes refugees as individuals with a, quote, well-founded fear of persecution, in line with the definition established by the United Nations. It is also established that the Office of Refugee Resettlement within the Department of Health and Human Services will oversee asylum policy. The Refugee Act also provides a mechanism to raise the cap on annual refugee intake. So applying for refugee status is a separate process from applying for entry as an economic migrant, and refugees may apply from their home country or within their first year of entering the United States. Spouses and children of those seeking asylum are also considered in the application, and unaccompanied children can also apply independently. In order to qualify for asylum, applicants must meet the legally recognized definition of a refugee, must have no record of serious crimes, and cannot have already resettled in another country. Much of the current attention on U.S. immigration policy is focused here on those entering the country as asylum seekers. Finally, one can enter the country illegally. Policies regarding illegal immigration are primarily regulated by the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986 and the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigration Responsibility Act of 1996. Immigration and Customs Enforcement is responsible for the prevention and investigation of illegal immigration. Those who enter illegally can be subject to deportation. So with that background, it is my pleasure to introduce today's moderator, my colleague here at Brookings, David Wessel, Senior Fellow and Director of the Hutchins Center on Fiscal and Monetary Policy in Economic Studies. And David will introduce our panelists and moderate the conversation. David?
Thank you, Camille. Some of you may have noticed that although the billing for this had Elaine Kamarck on our panel, Elaine is unfortunately sick, although she assured me she's watching from her sickbed at home. So any moment I expect an email telling me I said something wrong. She did give me her talking points, so I'm not going to try and impersonate Elaine, but I'm going to share with you some thoughts. So our goal today was to, as Camille said, is to try and shed some light on what is a very heated debate and to not focus only on the politics or only on the economics, but both. And I think we have a pretty good panel to do that. Madeline Zavodny at the far end is the Donna L. Gibbs and First Coast Systems Professor of Economics at the University of North Florida. She's written a couple books on immigration, Beside the Golden Door, U.S. Immigration Reform in a New Era of Globalization, and a book titled The Economics of Immigration. She's an economist. She has a PhD from MIT. Tara Watson is director of our Center for Economic Security and Opportunity and a senior fellow in economic studies. She's been a professor of economics at Williams College and did a stint at the Treasury as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Microeconomic Analysis. She's also an economist. I can't remember where your PhD is from.
Harvard.
Harvard PhD. And she is an author of a recent book called The Border Within, The Economics of Immigration in an Age of Fear. And Roy Teixeira is a non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and writes a lot about the transformation of party coalitions, the future of American electoral politics, and particularly the impact of demographic change on our politics. Before joining AEI, he was a senior fellow for almost 20 years at the Center for American Progress. But more importantly, he had a couple stints as a visiting fellow here at Brookings. Ray has a PhD in sociology. I have no graduate degree, so that's why I'm the moderator. So Madeline, I wonder if I could start with you. There's a lot of talk about what effect does immigration, broadly defined, have on the American labor market, on the workers who are already here, on the workers who come here. And I know you've done a lot of work on that. So how would you describe that?
So there isn't a better time, I think, to be talking about immigration than right now. I'm just hoping that we're not overtaken by events at this moment by the White House doing something. There are lots of things that we know about immigration as economists that I think the general public doesn't know or might not believe if they do know. And one of those things is a very clear consensus among economists that the economic impact of immigration in the U.S. is small. Regardless of really how big the magnitude of flows are, our economy is able to absorb either small or large numbers of immigrants, particularly over the long run, which means about 10 years, with very small effects on U.S. natives. Now, that said, there are a couple of groups who do tend to be adversely affected. One is the least educated U.S. natives, people who haven't finished high school. And part of that is because historically, at least until post the Great Recession in 2007 or so, a lot of the flows coming into the U.S. were people who had very low levels of education. And so those U.S. natives who also had very little education were facing a lot of labor market competition. The other group is previous immigrants, because of course newly arriving immigrants are very close substitutes with those previous immigrants. But for the average U.S. native, immigration is often a complement, not a substitute in the labor market. It might actually increase your wages or increase your employment opportunities. But this comes as a surprise, I think, to a lot of people, even though as the National Academy of Sciences study in 2017, which was this huge study, made very clear there's this consensus among economists. Right? So why don't people, why do we know that it's small? Besides, all of these fancy econometric studies, right? Thinking back behind, what's going on behind the scenes. One thing is, immigrants, when they come, they not only, many of them work, they also buy things. So in that way, they're not only increasing labor supply, they're increasing labor demand, right? So they're creating jobs for people as well. Immigrants often go to different places than lots of U.S. natives live. And again, they tend to go to places where previous immigrants are. So they're in ethnic enclaves within cities. They're going to very underpopulated rural areas where there's meat packing plants that are desperate for workers. They fill lots of gaps in the labor market in some cases, either at the low end, at the middle, or at the very top end for professors, computer scientists, things like that. They tend to be very entrepreneurial. Immigrants are more likely to start a business. Again, maybe at the low end, an auto body shop, maybe at the very high end. We can certainly think about Sergey Brin, Elon Musk, these very famous immigrants who have founded the unicorn type companies. The U.S. economy is incredibly flexible as well. So this is what allows us to absorb large numbers of immigrants. one thing that economists have shown very clearly, Zavodny Perry, who's at University of California, Davis, has a whole bunch of studies showing this, is that U.S. natives tend to switch occupations when their industry or occupation gets a large influx of immigrants. And what U.S. natives tend to do is they tend to move into higher paying occupations. So suppose that you work in construction, there's a large inflow of immigrants. Maybe you become now the construction manager who deals with the clients because your comparative advantage, in economics speak, is speaking English. Maybe you move into sales or marketing, something like that. If you work in a high-tech field, and there's a lot of computer programmers coming in, maybe you move out of computer programming, and again, you move into managerial type roles. You move into human resources. You move into the public relations and customer service parts of the profession. Right? And those jobs often pay more. Right? Not only do people respond, businesses, who are people, respond as well. They change their, not to sound like Mitt Romney, but they change their product mix. They change how they make whatever they make, as well as changing what they make. When we get more workers, it often slows automation. It slows offshoring, the movement of jobs overseas, so it can actually keep more jobs in the United States. And there's research out of the Wharton School of Business that shows this. And so again, the U.S. economy can absorb very, very large numbers of immigrants. Even the large flows that we've been getting for the last year, year and a half or so.
So what do we know about communities, say South Florida, New York, parts of California, urban areas which get lots of immigrants, partly for the reasons you suggested, that people tend to go where they know people or have relatives? Is the impact on the native or recently arrived immigrant there more severe, and is that something we should worry about?
Definitely there are concentrated costs at the state and local level, and a lot of that is because immigrants recently they've been bringing children. They're also relatively young, so they tend to have more children. And so there's costs that are imposed particularly on school districts. So you might see some overcrowding. You might see some increased need to hire teachers. You might see some pressure as well on rental markets and on housing markets in the short run. Right? And over time, immigrants tend to disperse across the country. They don't necessarily stay where they initially went. We hire more teachers, we build more buildings, and we can absorb them. But definitely there are costs in state and local areas that get large numbers of immigrants that federally we don't deal with well.
Right, and I think Tara and Wendy Edelberg have a suggestion. Let me ask you one more question. What do we know about the pattern of upward mobility among immigrants, their children, and their children's children?
Sure. So the immigrants have followed the same trajectory for over 100 years. So my family came 1880s through 1910s, right? And so they were initially farmers. Then people started going to college, and now I'm a college professor. And what the phrase is, Italians then, Mexicans now. And so the intergenerational progress really hasn't changed. I think the data are quite clear on that, and it is surprising to many people.
And is it different than from natives? Is there more upward mobility among immigrants?
In many cases, yes, because the immigrants who come in are disproportionately at the bottom.
So Tara, you can comment on what Madeline said, but I wanted especially to ask you to talk a little bit about why your work suggests that we need immigrants for demographic reasons, given that we're an aging society, fertility rates are low, and they don't appear to be picking up. How do the immigrants fit into that part of our economic challenge?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. There are many aging societies around the world, of course. We have declining fertility, as you said. We're probably around 1.7 children per woman. We have a related challenge, which is the aging of the population. So not only are we having fewer children, but the baby boomers are entering their later years, and people in general, even after the baby boom is sort of the squirrel that's gone through the python, we're still going to have an...
Squirrel? No, squirrel.
Elephant. I couldn't think of the...
Squirrels can be pretty tasty.
You're distracting me. We're still going to have much longer longevity than we've had in the past. And so we're going to have many more people who are in their 90s, in over 100. And even though at every given age, those people are likely to be healthier than in the past, they're still going to require support and care. So there's a challenge related to direct care for our older population, as well as a general issue that there are fewer working age people relative to the older population than there were in the past. So if we think back to 1970 and we look at workers ages 18 to 64, there were 5.7 of those for every person 65 and up. If we fast forward 50 years to 2020, we're at 3.7 workers for every person 65 and up. Now we go to 2040, not that long from now, we're at 2.7 workers for every worker 65 and up. So we just have many, many fewer people doing the work that will support the society as a whole. So that, of course, has implications both for the direct care work that I mentioned earlier, but also for the sustainability of our systems like Social Security and Medicare. And if you dig into the numbers like the Social Security trustees report does and says what are the implications for Social Security solvency over the long haul, immigrants are not going to completely solve our Social Security solvency issue, but they do help. So if you look at the most recent trustees report, they try to project over 75 years what kind of problems are we going to have financing Social Security. If we have what they call high immigration scenario, we're looking at being in the whole 3.12% of the payroll tax base, which is the denominator they use. If we have a high immigration scenario, that's a high immigration scenario. If we have a low immigration scenario, they're talking about 3.9% of payroll. So we are in trouble either way, in a sense. We need to make some changes, but immigrants and immigration policy can be a big part of a solution to those big demographic trends.
So Madeline mentioned that in some communities with concentrations of immigrants, lots of recent immigrants, people, many of whom have kids or are kids or going to have kids, that's creating some local and economic challenges. And could you just describe a bit the proposal that you and our colleague Wendy Edelberg had for how the federal government might deal with that?
Sure. So if you look into the data, a lot of the costs that immigrants impose on governments specifically, so fiscal costs, are relatively concentrated when they first arrive and are relatively concentrated at the state and local level. So education, as Madeline mentioned, healthcare is another key category. But the benefits largely accrue at the federal level, and that's because immigrants pay income taxes. Even undocumented immigrants pay into the revenue streams for federal government. And so there's this mismatch between the federal government is benefiting in terms of its fiscal picture, sort of separate from all these economic issues we've been talking about, and the state and locals are bearing some costs in the short run, and that's certainly true with this more recent influx right now, who additionally need support in terms of shelter and other things that are somewhat atypical. So the mismatch there led Wendy Edelberg and I to argue that we should be redirecting some resources from the federal government to places that are absorbing a lot of new immigrants with less education, which are the ones where that fiscal cost is the most biggest problem. Yeah.
So basically the federal government should send some money to the places that are having the most concentrated costs.
That's right, because in the long run, the federal government will still win out. But in the short run, states and localities face these costs. They don't have a lot of flexibility in their budgeting to think about the long run, and so some places need help. Yeah.
So Roy, I hang out with a lot of economists, and what you heard from Madeline and Tara is very much, I think, the consensus of the economics profession. But when you look at the public opinion polls or just see what voters say when they talk to reporters, or which is I've been talking to a lot of voters lately, but there's clearly it's a huge issue, and many people in the public do not see this huge economic benefit that the economists described. So what's going on here? Why is that?
Right. Well, if they got the memo from the economists about how wonderful immigration is, they didn't read it. So, yeah, well, let's just kind of briefly, what is the situation now in terms of public opinion and immigration and its political salience? Right now, immigration is probably the second most salient issue to voters, according to most polls. In other words, economy, inflation is first. But, immigration is really rocketed up the chart, so to speak, and now is a clear second in most polls. And how does that play politically? Right now, probably Trump is favored by 20 or 30 points on immigration and border security over Biden. There's an enormous level of concern about the issue. Most people think it's not just a problem, but a crisis. People really do think we need to do more on border security. Now, if you look, in fact, I mean, this is not new in a sense. I mean, if you look at public opinion data over decades, I mean, people have always been for, pretty tight border security, for more spending, more enforcement, but the salience of that goes up and down, and the level can go up and down. And that's what we're seeing right now, that it's both more salient, and we have more people thinking it's a huge concern, and they want something done about it. So why is that? Okay, why are people concerned so much about immigration right now? Well, I think one thing that's very important to differentiate here is the issue of immigration and the issue of illegal immigration. These are not coterminous. They're not the same thing. I mean, illegal immigration is a subset of immigration overall. But what are people really concerned about? They're mostly concerned about illegal immigration by the situation, the disorder and chaos they see at the border. They see people flowing into cities that they might live near or live in. They see the pressure that's being put on social services, the fiscal costs. There's a sense among a lot of these people that there's pressure on the low-wage labor market and just a general sense of social disorder. People, if you look at it, another part of public opinion, right, people kind of like immigration. They like immigrants. They think immigrants overall benefit the country. But what people really don't like is illegal immigration, in a sense that people can just sort of waltz into the United States and kind of hang out indefinitely, which basically they can do right now because of the way the asylum system has essentially been gamed by people coming into the country. And that's what Biden recently has tried to clamp down on, which is enormously popular, like 70% approval by the public. What people want is immigrants who come here legally, and they work hard, and they play by the rules. And that's fine with people. That is fine. That's not the problem. The problem is illegal immigration, and that's why it's such a salient issue today. That's why the Republicans benefit so much from talking about the issue, because they know that people are unhappy about very high levels of illegal immigration and the knock-on effects on that, and just this general sense that, people are basically taking advantage of the United States, taking advantage of its borders. I mean, people know we're a nation. We're a nation of citizens. We have borders. Those need to be enforced. There need to be some rules. There needs to be an orderly process. If we want immigration reformed over the long term, right? We need a better immigration system. This is broken, right? So people would prefer, if you ask them, to have a situation where maybe there could be higher levels of legal immigration. Maybe it should be skills biased. I mean, we don't know exactly what can be sold to the public, but we will not sell to the public and to voters is sort of like, well, there's this ton of illegal immigration, and really, trust us, it's going to benefit us in the long run. People shouldn't worry about that. It's all those, the only people who possibly object to this are racists and xenophobes. That's not true. I mean, ordinary people, ordinary voters, particularly working class voters, very concerned about this. It's gotten to the point where you can ask, CBS News recently asked a question, would you support a national program to start deporting all illegal immigrants in the United States? This is a pretty heavy-duty question. 60% said yes, right? I mean, I think that's soft. I don't think people are running around saying, oh, my God, we got to deport everybody. But the fact that you would get that response now is remarkable, including among 53% of Hispanic registered voters, 55% of white college-educated voters, right, who tend to be much more liberal than white working-class voters who are off the charts on this one. So we're clearly at a point where we need to do something about the immigration system, but we're not going to do it without basically what Biden is doing, and even more, to actually assure people we have control of the border. People are not just waltzing in. They're not just gaming the system. I mean, this is This has to be stopped. And if you want more immigration in this country over the medium to long term, you're going to have a reform agenda that basically changes the criteria in which people are admitted, that makes clear who is admitted, that enforced who gets admitted, and that can actually be sold to the public as this is good for you, right? But we will not sell to the public is the current system we have and the laxness we've seen recently at the border. It's like a good thing and not a bad thing. I just think that's the nature of the beast.
We haven't had a major immigration reform since 1990. There are been proposals floating around that would do what you suggest, and somehow they never get through Congress. They get close, and then something blows up. Why is that? Is that just the dysfunction of Congress, or?
You may not have heard this, David, but we're a kind of a polarized country these days, and it's a little bit hard.
I don't have a PhD in sociology, so I don't know these
It's a little hard to get the two sides to kind of agree on anything, particularly about a hot-button issue like this. But clearly there are, a substantial section of the Republican Party that is, borderline nativist. They just don't want to do anything about this, right? They prefer to have almost no immigration. But there's a significant section of the Democratic Party that doesn't want to see the current situation change. They don't want tighter border security. They think it's borderline racist, if not outright racist, to do it. I mean, look at the reaction from Pramila Jayapal when recently head of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, when Biden did this, I think in some ways relatively modest attempt to tighten up the borders. This is terrible, this is awful, this is racist, we should have more resources for people, we need to, basically fix the situation of the people who are now in the country are illegally. We need to totally reform the system before we do anything like this. It's just ludicrous. That's not going to happen. So, this is like failing to support a modest step in the direction of reassuring people Democrats care about border security. So if you can get, you can get the Republicans moving in the direction of accepting some changes to the system, doing something about the illegal people here already, so on and so forth, and you can get the Democrats to admit that you need to actually have a very, sort of serious system that incorporates border security. Eventually, maybe you'll get a bipartisan agreement on that. But I would just add, you say that's difficult. Yeah, it's difficult, but you will not get any serious reform of the immigration system unless it is bipartisan. The idea that, you can actually push through the version that left-wing Democrats think as real immigration reform is just like cloud cuckoo land. It's not going to happen. So, this is a very serious...
Can I push back on that a little bit?
Yeah.
So I think clearly Republicans are concerned about the border. They're concerned about the perceived level of chaos at the border. The border is under-resourced. There are a lot of people coming to the border, and the capacity is not there to handle it. I think it gets lumped in to illegal immigration, by which most people, when they think of that term, mean people sneaking across the border in the middle of the night, and that's not what is happening these days. What is happening is people are presenting to an official at the border. They, more so than in the past, are being let into the U.S. On a temporary basis without an official visa so that they can seek asylum. And so while they don't have a legal visa, and therefore it can be called by some people illegal immigration, I think it's really a fundamentally different thing. They are briefly screened. But the reality is we do have a lot of people, millions of people who have come in the past few years.
Don't you think they're basically
mechanism.
economic migrants who are basically gaming the system? You don't think that's true?
I think there is a large group of people who are here for both economic reasons and because their home countries are in really bad shape, and they view this as an opportunity to escape that. So we will see what the asylum courts do. At the moment, there are roughly half of those people who are getting through the asylum process, which takes a very long time because we are so backlogged, are getting asylum, which means they've met a fear standard. And so some judge is agreeing that they are, in fact, meeting that threshold for an asylum seeker. But clearly there's some economic motivation given our strong...
I think we should at least note that there was a bill that was moving until Trump blew it up. So it's not like it's all left-wing
Like I said,
Democrats.
we're a polarized country.
But that bill only dealt with the border, right? And we spent over a decade, from 2007 to about 2019, the unauthorized immigrant population in this country was actually falling. And we didn't get anything done. Right, and so, of course, the situation at the border post the COVID has just created havoc and has dashed any hopes of doing anything. But I don't think we would have done anything anyway.
I mean, we had the attempt in 2013 to try to do comprehensive reform.
Let me interject with Elaine's talking point. So Elaine is a senior fellow in governance studies here at Brookings, but she did a stint working on Gore's reinventing government thing. So she's focused a little bit on, in this regard, in the mechanisms. And if she were here, she would make these points. Even if we could get the politics straight, and I guess we are a polarized country, and we could get agreement on a law about the border, we still face what she calls enormous management issues at the border, and she makes 4 points. One is, there are a lot of people who want to come here. We know that's a fact. I'll spare you the numbers. 2, it's really hard to hire people at the border. The compromise bill that Trump helped defeat provided funding for 1,500 new Custom and Border Patrol agents, but it would take years to hire them because Customs and Border Patrol has to compete with other law enforcement agencies. They need security clearances, and for reasons which I don't understand, 65% of the people who apply to Customs and Border Patrol fail a polygraph test, which is higher than other law enforcement. I wish Elaine were here to explain that one to me. The work is in remote towns on the southern border. People don't necessarily want to live there. And she points out that President Trump attempted to hire 7,500 new border agents. The company he hired, or the government hired to facilitate the hiring, ended up hiring only 58 new agents. So it's hard to hire at the border. Part 3 is there's a classic problem of surge management, which means that you have to have a workforce big enough to deal with a situation that can fluctuate wildly. And we know that there have been a lot of ups and downs during COVID and since. She points out that in October of fiscal year 2021, the number of land border encounters at the southwest border was 72,000. A year later, it had more than doubled to 165,000. And in a year after that, it was 240,000. So all that while, the number of agents at the southwest border remained constant at 16,000. And she says that the problem of surge management is that it's beyond the control of the Customs and Border Patrol. Like Venezuela falls apart and a lot of people want to come here. Or we have a recession and suddenly there are fewer jobs, so there's fewer people crossing the border. So like it's hard to plan for surges when they're unpredictable. And fourth, as Teixeira just mentioned, there's a real shortage of immigration judges. She says there are currently 682 immigration judges on the bench, and the pending cases per judge is 4,500. So people are left waiting years to see a judge, and that's one of the reasons why people have so little confidence in the system. Her plan, so I'm not going to defend this plan, guys, this is hers. Close the border temporarily so we're not adding to the backlog. Recruit immigration judges to work through the backlog by offering to pay their law school debts, and have a plan for surges, something like the National Guard. Stand by people who are trained and available to come work on the border when there are a lot of people coming through. So so that's Elaine. That's what Elaine would say if she were here, and you're welcome to respond. Madeline, you look like you were going to have a heart attack when Roy was talking. Didn't mean to cut you off. So why is there such disconnect between what Roy picks up, which is clearly a lot of public angst about immigration, and the belief that you have with evidence that actually it's good for the economy and that a lot of people benefit by having immigrants in their community? How do we make sense of this?
I'm going to leave that to the sociologist, honestly. But I think that there are so many failures of our immigration system. But part of the failure is that we don't provide enough legal pathways for people to come. We make it incredibly, incredibly hard to come on a temporary work visa, particularly if you are going into what we would classify as a low-skilled job, right? That we only have, 66,000 H-2B visas available for 1 year in the typical year. It is very, very hard if you don't have an immediate relative here to be sponsored by a U.S. citizen and so on. So that's not the only reason why people are coming to the border and trying to cross illicitly and then finding a Border Patrol agent and turning themselves in and ask for asylum. But part of it is that we're not providing enough legal pathways.
Right. Well, you would agree with that, right?
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with that. Absolutely. I mean, again, people like legal immigrants who work hard and play by the rules. So if you figure out a way to reform the system or change the system so that there are more legal pathways, and you at the same time, cut down and tighten up border security so we don't have so many illegal immigrants, I think you're on the way to a solution. Though, again, how you actually are able to do that in a way that's politically feasible, you get some bipartisan support, that's yet another question. But I think that's fine. I think that if we believe that over the long term we need more immigrants in this country because of low fertility and an aging society, hey, that's fine. That's a reasonable point of view. But if you're going to do it the right way. Do it through the legislature, through Congress, through selling it to the American voters. Don't do it by basically sort of being very lenient in the border and everyone claims asylum and they kind of stream in. This is like a really bad idea. Even if it's done for good reasons or good-hearted reasons, humanitarian reasons, it's a terrible idea. It promotes social division. It's incredibly unpopular, and you're just going to turn people against immigration writ large. That's my position.
Do you think this may be beyond what you've thought about? Are we all that different than Europe in this regard? They seem to be wrestling with some of the very same
absolutely. Europe has a lot of the same problems. Look at the EU elections that were just held. The right populist forces made huge gains, and the most liberal pro-immigration parties lost the most. So,
if I can share my theory about why we haven't managed to expand those legal pathways.
Can you talk a little bit about the roundtable you've been participating in?
Sure. I run a private roundtable at Brookings with some folks from AAI and Cato. To talk about what's happening in immigration policy, and partly as a result of those conversations, my belief is that there is an overlapping consensus that we should have more legal pathways for immigration, and the exact contours of that there's probably less agreement on, but there is some general consensus on that point. However, if we think about the political incentives of the left and the right, the left sort of wants to hold that hostage until they can meet other priorities, which include pathways to citizenship for undocumented populations and perhaps some looser asylum rules. And on the right, the same consensus part of the puzzle is being held hostage because of these border security issues. So essentially, even though they would all agree to some package of reforms in this legal pathways, neither are willing to budge on these other issues. And that leaves us in this situation where since 1990, the number of immigrants that can legally come through most of these pathways is fixed, even though the size of our economy has more than doubled. And so we are just not keeping up with our economic need. And I would argue that part of what we see at the border is exacerbated by the fact that we don't have the appropriate legal pathways.
So we got a number of questions, some of which we've touched on. One question was, is there any evidence that investing in the countries where people are coming from actually does anything to the flow of immigrants coming here?
It increases it.
Why is that?
It increases it in the short run, where the short run is quite a while. So you could either informally call it the migration hump, more formally call it the migration transition, that when you're very, very poor, you can't afford to migrate to the United States. It is incredibly expensive to get up here, hire a smuggler, and so on. Whereas when your country becomes a little bit wealthier, you start getting more resources in your community, in your family, you can borrow some money. Now you can make that trip. So instead of staying at your home or migrating within your region or within your own country, now you can come to the United States. So it would actually increase immigration.
That's interesting. There was a question, which I don't know that any of us can really answer because it has to do with predicting what happens after the election, but I'll ask it anyways. Some economists expect a major economic boost for immigration in the next decade, especially after the Congressional Budget Office kind of discovered, reported, documented that we actually had a lot more immigrants in the last couple of years than we had thought, and that's one reason why we've been able to create so many jobs, because we had more workers than we thought. But to what extent do you think these long-run changes in immigration are going to be influenced by who wins the presidential election?
The CBO actually has immigration really high from 23 and 24, and then gradually coming back down. And that's basically because no one really knows what's going to happen in either scenario. So I think that the next president will have more to do with what happens in the next couple of years than any kind of long run. At the end of the day, this is actually a congressional issue, and so eventually Congress is going to need to take this up.
Leon Panetta once said that when it came to the federal deficit and the long run debt problems of the United States, it would take either crisis or leadership. And he said both had failed, so I don't know he doesn't have a theory of change anymore. But I do wonder whether there's a possibility, Roy, that the amount of heat and attention on immigration and the problems at the border provide that kind of action-forcing crisis that gets Congress to do something. Do you think, what would you give the odds of that? Somewhere north of zero?
Yeah, somewhere north of zero. The question is how far north?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to make predictions, especially about the future. I mean, look, if Trump gets in, he'll try to crack down. If Biden gets in, probably squeaks through, you realize, geez, we just barely won. This immigration's still a hot issue. Maybe I need to do even more down the path that I did before the election. So maybe we'll get into a period either way where there'll be a concerted effort to crack down on illegal immigration and not exactly seal the border, but make it much less porous than it has been. And maybe that would create a better sort of opportunity or palette for legislative action that would actually increase legal pathways and do some of the things that people here have been talking about. And over the long term, perhaps that would help us get where we want to go. So yeah, I mean, in that sense, maybe your theory about it's so hot right now that, you can't just ignore the issue anymore. You can't just muddle through. Muddling through isn't an option anymore. So,
I was trying to inject a note of optimism into this conversation.
So after the deluge, so to speak, perhaps we'll have some action.
Yeah, interesting. You guys want to make political predictions?
No, but I do recall that the Obama administration tried this idea that if we just get a little tougher at the border, then the political actors will come together with consensus, and that did not.
No, but I was suggesting that the climate was different. I mean, it's not.
Definitely was.
Right, it shows up. It's impossible for politicians to ignore it. And at some point, there's going to be pressure on Congress to do something about something that people care about. I mean, compare this to the deficit, where, a whole bunch of wonks worry about the deficit and most Americans don't. This is in a totally different category.
Agree.
I think.
Yeah, the other forcing issue might be some of these labor issues that I talked about in specific fields, and also we might see the business community sort of being more of a voice than they have been to this point for reasons I don't fully understand, advocating for more worker flows. And I think everyone would agree it's better to have those worker flows coming through a legal pathway that is regularized rather than what's happening at the border right now.
Mm-hmm. One idea that I've seen floated around, it's been pushed by among others, the Economic Innovation Group, is to have a new visa category that counties could decide that if they needed workers, they could get, if they call it, I forget, place-based immigrant visas as a compromise, a way to, if you're a community that wants immigrants, you would be able to essentially have a quota of visas you can get.
So you kind of order them up almost.
Well, but also it's a way to deal with the diversity of the country, where some places want them. Although the Wall Street Journal had a terrific story a couple weeks ago about West Virginia, which is starving for workers, and have more hostility to immigration there than almost anywhere else. So it's not, people don't always act in the way that economists think is their self-interest, I've noticed.
Right. Well, when you say starving for workers, we mean the sort of economic actors and some of the pols, I suppose. But I mean, the ordinary people, they don't walk around in West Virginia saying, "I'm thirsting for more immigrants."
No,
so that's the problem.
But you go and you can't get, you have to wait a long time to get service at an emergency room because they're short of people.
Right, but I'm just saying the
or
people.
half the tables at the restaurant are closed because they don't have workers.
So
right?
That's not how they interpret it.
I get that they don't interpret it, but I mean, it is true that I discovered during COVID that supply chain problems and labor shortages were excuse for every service business that let you down. So people don't often believe that. But
Right. There's certain skepticism there.
yeah. Let me give the audience a chance to answer a question. I think we have some mic runners. The gentleman over here. So I have a favor to ask. I moved too quickly, so she's going to get the mic runners. It would be better if you stood up so we can see you, say who you are, and we have a lot of people here, so I like to have questions with a question mark and not a speech. Sorry, Catalina, to advance the timing. Thank you.
Thank you for a very interesting subject. My name is Lex Riefel, formerly with Brookings, and I want to start off by saying I'm a fan of immigration because my father was an immigrant. What mystifies me is that these discussions of immigration take place without any reference to what a sustainable population for the United States is. I mean, maybe 40 years ago, we had half the size of the population, half as many Americans as there are now. Another 40 years, we could have twice as many. But I mean, how many people do we want to have in this country? And don't more people have a connection to climate change? More people, more consumption, more climate change problems? So maybe there's some smaller level of population that's sustainable from the United States. Thank you.
You want to take?
Do you want to? I have a lot.
Okay.
I mean, I think climate change is a global issue more than the U.S. And I would push back gently and say that I don't think we want to say that people have to remain poor just in dysfunctional countries and mired in poverty just to help with the climate. I think we can absorb, again, large numbers of people. We're a very empty country for the most part.
I mean, you're right that the population has increased, but we have managed to do that and provide a rising standard of living over time. So some of this is what the point you make, I think, which is worth thinking about, is that we can't obviously house the entire world population in the United States. So we do have an interest in helping to raise the living standards in other places. And that's a longer conversation, which I'm happy to have another time. This woman here in the front.
Thanks. My name is Peggy Sands-Orchowski. I've been a congressional journalist covering immigration for 15 years, and I have 2 books out. One's The Law That Changed the Face of America, and it's coming out in paperback this summer. So what I'm curious about is there is no mention about the immigration laws, if there's any. Do you see any limits at all? I mean, you made a comment that anybody who has economic problems, it's justified that they can come through dozens of countries to come here and come in illegally. And Ray is exactly right. I write for a Hispanic magazine. They're furious. Most Hispanics are furious about illegal immigration. So why don't you specify illegal, temporary, permanent? There are real solid categories that the American public can handle 3. They can handle 3.
I think you're misrepresenting what Sarah said.
I didn't mean to give the impression that I think anyone with an economic need should come to the U.S. without.
Is there a limit?
I do think that the U.S. needs to have some limits on immigration. I just think they should be much higher than they currently are.
But one thing that is true, I'll just add, I mean, based on her comment, is it's very interesting to track the views of Hispanics on these issues. I mean, people generally tend to assume all Hispanic voters, they're pro-immigration. This is a really big issue for them. They want us to be more liberal than we are. The reverse is true at this point. They're moving rapidly toward a much more restrictionist position, Hispanic voters, actual citizens, right? So that's an important part of why we see Hispanics moving toward the Republicans in most places, is they're actually not big pro-immigration voters. They actually are concerned about the flows of illegal immigrants and sort of the implications that has for their communities.
So do you basically think that, I think you've written this, so I know you think this, that Biden actually made a mistake, that he didn't get to where he was today earlier in his administration?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Big mistake.
Because?
Because it just allowed the issue to explode over time with the massive flows of illegal immigrants. And you see the, public opinion just became more and more, I don't know, sort of hardcore in this. People became more and more concerned about it, had more and more, sort of hardline positions on it. The Republican position appealed more and more to people. And now Biden finally is moving in the direction of sort of trying to close down the border, at least temporarily and at least in some ways. So, but, actually what he did when he came into office was, completely predictable. It would have this reaction in terms of what he did on the asylum system and a lot of other things, and sort of trying to reverse what was believed to be Trump's kind of anti-humanitarian policies at the border. It basically sent a loud signal to, potential migrants and to the cartels. It's going to be a lot easier to get in now. Let's all come. And you know what they did? This is like, talk about economics. You reduce the costs of coming, more people will come. It wasn't rocket science. So that happened, and I think Biden just let it happen. And, I wrote a piece about this in my Substack called Joe Biden, Prisoner of the Progressive Left, because one big reason why he let it go on for so long and let the crisis fester is because there was so much pressure on him from the left of the party not to do anything on this. Just let it ride. As you pointed out, the left of the party is pretty committed to not only what we have now, but even more liberal.
So I agree with you on the danger of generalizing about what Hispanics think. I'm reminded that in an earlier generation, the German Jews who came here first were very hostile to the Eastern European Jews, who they thought would, tend to be more peasants and not. But do you think but I think there's some ambivalence also. If there is some willingness, correct me if I'm wrong, to deal with people who are fleeing Ukraine, Afghanistan, places that are clearly not economic-only migrants. Is that
sure? Actual refugees are, like as we used to think about them, are, people have a much more generous attitude toward them. But what they don't trust now is that the asylum system, which was sort of originally created for people like that, is what we're getting now. Right. So, yeah, if we could restrict it to actual refugees, I think people would be pretty happy.
But it's hard to define. People leaving Venezuela, actual refugees?
No, I don't think so. I don't think they're refugees. Not in the sense it was originally intended. Political refugees who are basically going to be exterminated or arrested and killed if they're not given asylum. Asylum can't mean I'm leaving a dysfunctional society where there's a social disorder, the economy's collapsing. This sucks. I want to go to America. Those aren't refugees in the sense it was originally intended, in my view.
Looked like you wanted to say something, Madeline, but maybe not.
No, I agree. The Uniting for Ukraine program has been immensely popular. The Cuban, Haitian, Nicaraguan, Venezuelan programs are large. The big problem is we're just not getting through the asylum claims that are not going to meet the standard for persecution fast enough.
And if I can just maybe reframe the Biden's situation a little bit, it's a hard problem, right? So when he came into office, we had Title 42 in place that was allowing people to be not considered for asylum on public health grounds, even though that was probably not really due to public health concerns. It was a way of managing the border that sort of was in place, and he was able to take advantage of until May of last year. And once that ended, there were no similar rules in place until last week. So we have the situation where right now we are quote unquote closing the border. That's not really what's going to happen, but that means between ports of entry, if people present themselves to a Border Patrol officer, they can be removed. And that hasn't been happening very much in the intervening year or so. And but if you remove someone and there are thousands of people coming a day and you're removing them by saying, just go back across the border to Mexico, you need some cooperation from the country of Mexico in order to do that, which was not in place. So he was facing a really challenging situation. Right. And I agree, was probably exacerbated by the fact that the solution to that was then to let many people wait in the U.S. while their asylum claim was going through the
And it
process.
was kind of a visceral reaction to some of the harshness of the Trump policies as well, right? The separating kids from their parents thing.
Sure. I mean, that doesn't mean that the response was right, because it was a response, right?
So I'm trying to explain the response.
Wendell? I can say more about that, but I won't.
And then, Wendell, go for, you can go first, then we'll go.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, thank you so much. So my name is Anne-Lotte. I work for the Dutch Embassy at the Economic Department. And I find it really interesting to see, on one hand, research showing that there's like this room for immigrants. And then on the other hand, public opinion saying we don't want it, especially illegal immigrants. And I'm just curious, like, what can be done, or how can we like get research to the people to make like well-informed decisions, because now it seems that the research that has been done has not reached the public, or I don't know, there's some different definition of immigration. And I'm just wondering, like, how you can like combine those two or get those two more together.
Hold Brookings events?
So look, I think there are a couple things. First of all, places like Brookings and AEI exist on the hope that if you provide good research and information, it will influence at least the elites, if not the general public. Fortunately, we're not paid for performance. So it is hard. But secondly, I think what Roy's point has been is that people's impression of immigration is greatly informed by what they see on TV or social media about this chaos at the border. And people generally don't like chaos, and they feel like things are out of control. And so what Roy's point is that if you want to get a better rational immigration system, where perhaps one that, unlike the ones we've had in the past, but like the ones they have in Australia and Canada, are more based on the skills that people bring, then we have to figure out a way to calm people down that the border is not a disaster. And the third thing is that, as me, I'm not speaking for the other panelists, whenever we have economic distress, we tend to blame it on other people in other countries. It may be blaming it on people. I'm having trouble getting a job. It must be because there are a lot of people who don't look like me. Or we're having trouble with American manufacturing. It must be because China is doing something. And people tend to undervalue or underappreciate how much technological change may be responsible for their circumstance. It's always easier to blame somebody else, particularly someone who's foreign. And that's just a fact of life. And not sure that the Dutch have found the magic solution to this either, from what I understand. That's my best attempt at amateur sociology. Wendell.
Wendell Primus with Brookings. My question is, the Senate compromise that Trump has blocked, in your opinion, if it were allowed to go forward, how much of the border security problem would have been solved by that compromise? And I also think it didn't involve the Dreamers. Do the political parties differ on what ought to be done about the Dreamers?
I don't think that recent attempt at trying to do something about the border was likely to be that effective. In the same way, I don't think this Biden action is actually likely to be that effective. I think they are chipping away at some issues, but really it's a bigger problem that requires a bigger set of solutions. In terms of the questions about the Dreamers, you might have a better handle on the political landscape there.
So the Dreamers are people who came here as children, not legally, and they have temporary legal status, and we're trying to figure out a way to make it permanent.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at public opinion data, I mean, doing something about the Dreamers, I guess once you explain to people what they are, because a lot of people know what they are, I mean, it's pretty popular. I mean, people are sort of fine with it. I mean, getting a political compromise between the parties that would include, sort of legalizing the dreamers, that's part of what gets difficult, right? Because Republicans will say, okay, yeah, great idea, but what about border security? Are you really willing to do anything about that? And the Democrats say, we don't really want to do anything about that until we have comprehensive immigration reform. So this is the problem. It's not that the public doesn't want it. It's that the parties can't come together in a way that sort of brokers their issues and produces a compromise that would include this. But you're not going to get both parties suddenly standing up and saying, standalone issue, standalone legislation, we're going to legalize the dream. It's not going to happen.
Right. I think the dreamers kind of get held up by both parties because they're the most sympathetic group. Yeah. And so they become this huge bargaining chip, and therefore no one's willing to pass something just for them because they lose that chip. It'll be very interesting, I said at the very beginning about being overtaken by events, if the White House moves forward with offering parole to spouses, undocumented or illegal, spouses of U.S. citizens who are another somewhat sympathetic group, what will happen. Another group that gets left behind in all of this discussion is the children of H-1B workers who are in the queue waiting for a green card. They're going to be waiting potentially their entire lifetime if they're from India. And their children who were not born in the U.S. but have spent most of their lives here are aging out of the system and are about to join the same system their parents are trapped in. That's another very sympathetic group.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I guess the problem is no one's willing to take half a loaf, and they can't even agree on what the half a loaf is. And that's a political problem. I think we have time for one more question. The woman in the blue there, who I slighted before, I'm sorry.
No worries. Thank you so much. My name is Maddie. I'm a college student, classic Hilton this summer. And I'm fascinated by that.
Don't be so self-deprecating. Okay, come on.
Anyway, I'm fascinated by that mention of the decrease in the ratio between 18 to 64 workers and 65 plus. And I'm curious, I know we just touched on this with this recent era of technological progress and what seems like we're on the precipice of exponential growth in productivity and output. Could that growth substitute the need for immigrations writ large, or maybe even demerit the calls for that? Or are the flows of immigration maybe not directly affecting or benefiting those industries in the same way?
It's an interesting question. I mean, productivity growth, right, economic growth is a product of productivity growth and labor force growth. So we need immigration for labor force growth because productivity growth is low. At least you could, it's part of it, right? If there's an exponential increase in productivity, all of a sudden, everybody's better off in the country because, have productivity growth is 3% instead of 1.5%. Or 5% or 10%. I mean, these projections are insane about the influence of AI potentially in productivity. Now, what do I think about that? I think it's unlikely. I think there's a bit of a sort of intellectual bubble around how much AI is really going to increase productivity. So I would say if there was an exponential increase in productivity, it would be the case that you could probably get away with pretty slow labor force growth. But I'm not sure I believe that's going to happen.
Yeah, I think there are some sectors where there simply isn't going to be the scope for a technological substitution, and that would include the caregiving sector. At the end of the day, you're going to have some technological improvements. You might have robots helping to lift someone out of bed or something like that. But when you need care as a central part of the service that's being supplied, you need people to do that. And I don't think in those sectors we're ever going to be able to dwindle the labor force. And by all projections, that labor force is going to grow dramatically, even if technology continues apace. So I expect that we will continue to need a growing labor force, and we will continue to need immigrants in order to be part of that solution.
Great. So I think this was an excellent discussion that we touched on many of the issues that are in the paper or whatever you get your news these days. I'm old, so I get some newspapers. I admit it. But okay. Whatever you saw on Twitter. And I hope that the goal was to not change the public debate, but to at least inject some facts and analysis and evidence into what's very emotional. And I think we've succeeded because the panel is so good at expressing themselves and did it so succinctly. So please join me in thanking the panel. And I'll look forward to getting Elaine's report card by email later.
You did fine.
Great, thanks.